She was 19 years old, and she had nothing left. What she owned could be counted on the fingers of a single working hand: a change of clothes gone gray at the seams, a wool blanket that still held the smell of wood smoke and her father, $11 in soft paper and worn silver, and one thing more, wrapped in oilcloth and carried against her ribs like a second heart, a farrier's rounding hammer with a hickory handle worn smooth by a dead man's grip. With 6 of those $11 she bought a thing that every practical soul in the territory had already given up for dead: a collapsing one-room cabin at the dry edge of a dying town, its roof stove in, its door hanging by a single strap of cracked leather, its floor buckled and pale as old bone. The men gathered at the sale laughed out loud when she raised her hand. But what nobody knew, what she herself could not have dreamed, was that beneath those warped and rotten floorboards lay a secret nearly a quarter-century old, a secret that would quietly unmake the man who had cast her out, and build her an entire life from the wreckage he had left behind. Sit with us a while. Bank the fire, if you have one, and let the evening go soft at the edges, because this is not a story to be hurried through. Let us tell you the story of Della Sutton, of the hammer she carried and the floor she tore up and the dead man's words she read aloud to no one but the desert wind. Before we begin, tell us where you are listening from tonight, what town, what country, what quiet room, because we like to know who gathers around this fire with us. And if you find something here worth keeping, stay with us, follow along, so the next telling finds you too. She had been born to the ring of iron and the smell of scorched hoof, in the valley town of Concordia, where her father Elias Sutton kept a forge at the crossroads and shod every horse and mule that passed through the green heart of that country. Della had no memory that did not have the forge in it somewhere, the bellows breathing like a great slow animal, the coals waking from gray to orange to a white that hurt the eyes, the anvil singing its 2 notes, the low ringing strike and the light tap after it that her father called the smith's amen. She was a small girl underfoot at first, then a tall one at the bellows, then a young woman who could draw a bar down to a taper as clean as any man in 3 counties. Her father taught her the way you teach someone you intend to leave the world better than you found it, patiently, without flattery, correcting her hands with his hands until the motion lived in her own bones and needed no thought. He taught her that everything has a grain. The iron has a grain, he would say, turning a glowing bar in the tongs so she could see the long fibers of it drawn out under the hammer, and if you work across it you will crack it, but if you work along it you can bend it around the whole world, and it will not break. Wood has a grain, he said, and any fool who has ever split a log against it knows the truth of that. And people, Della, people have a grain too, deeper than the others and harder to read, and the whole art of a life is learning to feel for it, and work with it, and not against it. He said it so many times it stopped being words and became something closer to weather, a thing that was simply always there. Work with the grain, girl. There is more strength in yielding to the true line of a thing than in fighting it. The hammer had been his father's before it was his. It was a rounding hammer of good Sheffield steel, one face flat and one face domed for drawing metal, and the hickory of its handle had been shaped by 3 generations of hands until it fit the palm the way water fits a cup. On the last good evening of his life, when the cough that had been living in his chest all winter had gone quiet in a way that frightened her more than the noise of it ever had, Elias took the hammer from its nail, and wrapped it in oilcloth and put it in her hands and closed her fingers around it. This knows more than I do now, he said, and it will know more than you when your turn comes to give it away. He died before the frost came out of the ground. She shod the horse that carried his coffin herself, because there was no one else she would trust to do it, and she did not weep at the graveside, because her father had taught her that grief, like iron, must be worked while it is hot and then set aside to cool, and there was work yet to be done. The work was where the trouble waited. For the forge sat on land, and the land answered to a man named Silas Rourke, who owned the Concordia land and loan and who was, by every account that mattered in that valley, the most important man alive. Rourke was not a large man, nor a loud one. He was a man of paper and ink, narrow and dry, with a habit of pressing his fingertips together, as though weighing the air between his hands, and he measured every living thing by what it owed him, and what it might one day be made to owe. He kept ledgers the way other men keep religion, in tall green books ruled and read, and he believed with a cold and total faith that a number written in a ledger was truer than anything you could touch or smell or grieve. When Elias Sutton died, Rourke's clerks went through the accounts, and out of the accounts there arose, as if from nothing, a debt. There had been a note against the forge, Rourke explained, taken out years before to buy the great bellows and the new anvil, and the note had accrued its interest quietly in the dark of the ledger the way rust accrues on unbrushed steel, and now, with Elias dead and the note called due, the sum owed had grown to a figure Della could not have paid in 3 lifetimes of shoeing horses. She asked to see the note. She was shown a paper with her father's mark upon it, a mark she did not believe he had made, in an ink that seemed to her too fresh for its supposed years. But she was 19, and she was a woman, and she had no lawyer and no friend withstanding, and the paper sat between them on the polished desk like a stone laid over a well. There was no room for argument. The number had spoken, and in Rourke's world the number was the only voice that carried. The casting out, when it came without a raised voice. That was the whole cruelty of it, that no one shouted, that no one struck her, that a man she had never met rode out from town with a folded document and a deputy's badge and read to her in a flat and careful voice the terms by which the forge, the tools bolted to its floor, the very anvil that still held the warmth of her father's last day of work, now belonged to the Concordia Land and Loan. She was granted, the paper said, until the following noon to remove her personal effects. She did not plead. She did not weep in front of him, and she did not curse him, because she understood, in a cold clear place behind her breastbone, that a man who trusts only paper cannot be reached by anything as warm as tears. She wrapped the hammer in its oilcloth. She rolled her father's blanket. She took her $11 and her gray dress and she walked out of the only home she had ever known, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her now but paper, and paper burns. She walked south, because south was where the good country ended and the map stopped meaning anything. For the first day the road ran through the valley she knew, past orchards heavy with fruit and fences kept in good repair and barns painted red against the weather, the whole managed prosperity of a place that had decided long ago exactly what it would be. She passed people who knew her, and she nodded to them, and they looked away, because misfortune is a thing that many folk fear to catch by standing too near it. By the second day the orchards had given way to dryland farms scratching at thinner soil, and by the third day the farms had given way to grazing country gone hard and brown, and by the fourth the grazing country had given way to something that had never belonged to anyone at all. The land opened out and emptied. The green burned off the world by degrees until there was only the pale gold of dead grass, and then not even that, only the red and ochre bones of the earth laid bare, ridges of broken rock standing up out of the flats like the vertebrae of some enormous animal that had lain down to die before the first people came. The heat came up off the ground in sheets you could see. Creosote and greasewood held the only green, low and gray and bitter-smelling, and far off the mountains stood the color of old bruises, promising water they did not intend to give. She drank sparingly from a canteen she had filled at the last honest well, and she chewed the last of her bread, and she walked into that country the way you walk into cold water, one deliberate step after another, feeling the old life fall away behind her and something unmarked and terrifying and clean opening ahead. The town, when at last it came, was barely a town. It was called Coyote Wells, and it had been born in a hurry during the silver fever of an earlier decade and had been dying, without much conviction, ever since. A single crooked street of gray board buildings leaned against the wind. Half the windows were boarded and the other half were merely empty. A saloon still breathed, and a general store, and a stamp mill up the wash stood silent with its great iron machinery gone to rust the color of dried blood. The people who remained had the patient, dust-cured look of folk who had stopped expecting the world to improve. It was here, on the day Della arrived footsore and burned and down to her last $5, that the county was auctioning off the leavings of the dead and the departed, a scatter of forfeited lots and abandoned cabins that no one had paid the taxes on in years. They stood in the thin shade of the store's porch, a dozen men and a scatter of women, while a clerk in a sweat-ringed shirt read off the parcels in a bored sing-song. Most went unsold, met with silence and the shuffle of boots. Then he came to a lot at the far dry edge of town, A one-room cabin of adobe and warped plank that had belonged, he said, to a miner dead these many years, a place so far gone that the county would take any honest bid to be rid of the tax burden. A few men laughed. Somebody said it wasn't worth the powder to burn it. Somebody else said the only thing living in it now was scorpions and the ghost of a fool. Della looked at the cabin, low and lonely at the end of the street with the whole red desert opening behind it, and something in the set of it, stubborn and unwanted and still standing, spoke to something in her. She raised her hand and bid $6. The clerk squinted at her, and the men turned to look, and the laughter came again, softer now, almost kind, the laughter you give a child who has bid on the moon. No one bid against her. The cabin was hers. She counted $6 into the clerk's damp palm, and she had, when it was done, exactly $1 and some copper left in all the world, and a deed to a ruin, and a hammer wrapped in cloth. The cabin was worse inside than out. The roof had let in a decade of weather, and the single room smelled of dust and mouse, and the particular dry rot of a place the sun has slowly killed. But the adobe walls were thick and true, and thick walls are worth more than gold in that country, holding the cool of night through the burning day and the warmth of the fire through the cold of the dark. She swept it out with a bundle of dead creosote. She mended the door strap. She learned the great problem of the place fast, which was water, for the well that gave the town its hopeful name lay half a mile off and yielded a slow bitter trickle, and a body cannot carry enough water half a mile in that heat to do more than stay barely alive. Her first ally in the world came to her over the matter of water. He was an old man named Thaddeus Pike, though everyone who still spoke to him called him Thad, a retired well-digger and stonemason with a bad hip and a white beard stained yellow at the corners, who had come to Coyote Wells 40 years before chasing silver and had simply never found a reason worth the trouble of leaving. He watched her haul water 2 days running, and on the third he limped down to her cabin and told her flatly that she was doing it like a fool, that there was an old hand-dug seep in the wash behind her lot that the miner who built the place had used, choked now with sand but sweet underneath, and that he would show her how to open it if she would let an old man sit in her shade and drink his fill. It was a partnership born of pure necessity, his knowledge and her strong young back, and out of that plain arithmetic of need there grew, slowly, the first warm thing in her new life. They opened the seep together over 3 brutal days, Thad directing from a camp stool while Della dug, cribbing the sides with flat stones the way he taught her, working with the loose grain of the sand instead of against it, until the water came up clear and cold and steady enough to keep 2 people and a garden alive. He told her, resting in her doorway of an evening, what little he knew of the cabin's history. It had been built, he said, by a 49-man, a solitary and secretive fellow named Amos Wexler, who had come out from the eastern diggings with a mule and an assayer's kit and a look in his eye like a man carrying something heavy he could not set down. Wexler had kept to himself, worked a claim up the wash that everyone said was played out and worthless, and one hard winter, a quarter-century gone now and more, he had simply died alone in that cabin, and no one had found him until the spring, and no one had ever come to claim a thing that was his. Bad luck, Thad said and spat. That whole cabin's got bad luck in the grain of it. But he said it kindly, and he kept coming back, and Della began, without quite deciding to belong somewhere again. She turned then to the floor. It had troubled her from the first night, the way it rode uneven under her feet, the way one corner of it gave and sighed as though something beneath had shifted and settled wrong. A good floor is laid on joists set level and true, and this one had gone soft and canted, and Della, who could not abide a thing badly made, resolved to pull it up and lay it right. It was grueling, filthy, close work in a room that held the day's heat long into the night. She had no proper pry bar, so she used the claw of an old broken pick and the flat face of her father's hammer, easing each board up by the nails, saving what she could, working with the wood's long grain so it lifted whole instead of splintering. The boards came up gray and warped and studded with square-cut nails gone to rust, and beneath them was the bare tamped earth of the desert, and she began, board by board, the slow archaeology of another person's abandoned life. She found small things first. A tin cup gone green. A broken clay pipe. A child's carved wooden horse, which stopped her cold for a long moment, because it did not fit the story of a solitary man, and she could not say why it should hurt her so. And then, near the low corner where the floor had sighed and settled all these years, her borrowed pick struck something that did not sound like earth. It rang. Not the dull thud of stone but a flatter, hollow note, wood on wood, and she went down on her knees and dug with her hands in the lamplight, her heart beating in a way it had not beaten since her father died. She uncovered the top of a box, an oaken chest bound in iron straps, sunk into a pit dug beneath the floor and covered over with care by hands long dead. The straps were locked with a padlock the size of her fist, rusted into a single fused ruin, and there was no key in all the world that would ever turn it. So she did what she had been raised to do. She fetched the hammer. She braced the chest against the corner of the adobe wall, and she read the lock the way her father had taught her to read a stubborn weld, feeling for the true line of it, the flawed seam where the shackle met the body, and she set the domed face of the hammer against that line, and she struck. Not wildly, not in a fury, but in the old steady rhythm of the forge, the long ringing blow and the listening pause after it. Clang! She struck again, and again, working with the metal's fatigue instead of against it, and the fourth blow found the flaw she had been feeling for, and the fifth landed square upon it. Crack! The old shackle sheared clean through and dropped into the dust, and the sound it made, that small bright snap in the silence of the desert night, was the sound of one life ending and another beginning. She knelt there a long moment, breathing, before she lifted the lid. Gold. That was the first thing, the thing the eye could not help but seize upon, gold coins by the hundreds, double eagles stamped with the striding figure of liberty, $20 pieces gone soft bright in the lamplight, poured into leather sacks that had rotted through so that the coins had spilled and settled into a single heavy golden drift in the bottom of the chest. It was more money than Della had ever imagined in one place, more than the whole town of Coyote Wells had seen in a generation, more, she understood with a strange lurch, than the debt that had been forged against her father, more than the forge and the valley and Silas Rourke's whole polished desk. But she did not, in that first moment, feel rich. She felt watched. For there beside the gold lay other things, and those other things were the true weight of the chest. There was a leather-bound assayer's ledger, its pages close-written in a cramped and careful hand. There was a folded sheaf of documents tied with a faded ribbon, claim papers and assay certificates, and a bill of sale. And there was a letter, a single thick letter of many folded pages, sealed once with wax long since crumbled to red dust, addressed in that same careful hand to no name at all, but simply to whoever finds this, and has honest hands. Della sat back on her heels in the dust of the floor she had torn up, with a fortune spilling gold light beside her and a dead man's words in her lap, and she understood that she had not found treasure. She had been left an inheritance, and an inheritance carries a debt of its own. She read the ledger first, and then the papers, and slowly the shape of the thing rose up out of the numbers the way a drowned thing rises to the surface of a still pool. Amos Wexler had not been a failed miner. He had struck a true vein up that wash, a rich pocket of gold that he had worked in secret, telling no one, trusting no one, because he had learned in the eastern diggings what happens to a man who strikes it rich among strangers. He had assayed his own ore, recorded every ounce in that ledger, converted it coin by careful coin over years, and buried it beneath his own floor. And he had had one partner in the early days, a young man of business from back east who kept the accounts and held the money, a narrow, dry, ambitious young clerk named Silas Rourke. Della read the name, and the lamp seemed to gutter though there was no wind. She read on. The letter told the rest of it in a voice so plain and so steady that it was worse than any weeping. She unfolded all its pages and she read it aloud, though there was no one to hear her but the desert, because it seemed to her a thing that ought to be said out loud into the world at last after so long in the dark. To whoever finds this, and has honest hands, Amos Wexler had written. I am dying as I write, and I have no one, and so I must trust to a stranger and to God what I could not trust to any living man I knew. I struck gold in this place in the year of our Lord 1849, and I took into my confidence a young man named Silas Rourke, who kept my books and held my moneys and whom I trusted as I would have trusted a son. He was clever with numbers as I never was. And when the vein first showed its richness, Rourke came to me with papers he had drawn up himself, and told me they were the assay filings and the claim renewals, and I signed them, because I could scarcely read a page of business and I trusted him. But they were not what he said. They were a deed of transfer and a note of debt, and with them he claimed that the claim was his, and that I owed him besides for years of grubstake and supply, sums I never borrowed and never saw. He had turned my own trust into a rope to hang me with, all in ink, all in paper, all in numbers no honest man could argue against. Della's voice shook, and she steadied it, and she went on, because the dead man had steadied his own hand to write it, and she would not do less. There were others, Wexler wrote. I was not the only one. Rourke did the same to the Hollis brothers who worked the next claim, and to old Marta Vane who ran the boarding house and lent him money on a note he twisted against her, and to a half a dozen more besides, small people who could not fight him, and he took their diggings and their savings and their homes, all lawful on the face of it, all monstrous underneath, and then he took the coach east with a strongbox and a new name for his business. And he left this town to die. I hid what gold I had left where he would never find it, because I would sooner give it to a stranger with honest hands than let that man have 1 grain more of what he stole. If you are reading this, then you have opened what I locked, and the finding of it makes it yours. But I ask one thing only, from beyond the reach of my own hands. Do not do with it what he would do. Do not build yourself a throne of it. Find the ones he wronged, or their children, or their children's children, and give back what was taken, so that some good may grow at last out of all this buried grief. That is all I ask. That is the whole of my will. Amos Wexler, in the winter of his last year, at Coyote Wells. She sat with those pages a long while, until the lamp burned low and the desert cold came seeping up through the open floor, and the enormity of it settled over her like the dark. Here was the man who had cast her out. Here, in a dead man's failing hand, was proof that Silas Rourke had built his whole green empire in the valley on a foundation of forged papers and stolen claims, that the note he had conjured against her father was only the newest turn of a wheel he had been turning for 25 years, that she and Amos Wexler, and the Hollis brothers and old Marta Vane were all, across the gulf of a quarter century. The same story told again and again by the same cold hand. She had the power now to destroy him. She had the gold to hire lawyers, the letter to bring to the newspapers, the proof to drag his name through every courtroom in the territory. She thought about it that whole long night. She thought about the flat voice of the deputy reading her out of her home, and the polished desk, and the fresh ink on her father's forged mark, and she let herself, just once, feel the full hot pull of wanting him ruined. And then, in the grey of the morning, she set the wanting aside to cool, the way her father had taught her, and she chose otherwise. She thought of the grain. She thought of how there was more true strength in working along the line of a thing than in smashing across it, and how a man like Rourke lived entirely inside the world of accusation and argument and paper, and how to fight him there, on his own ground, in the courts and the newspapers he understood, would be to work against the grain and to become, in some small way, a thing shaped like him. Amos Wexler had not asked her to destroy the man. He had asked her to restore what the man had broken. And restoration, she understood, was a smith's work, the patient rebuilding of a broken thing into something whole and true, and it was the only work she knew how to do with love. She would not go to war with Silas Rourke. She would simply, quietly, undo him, by putting back into the world every good thing he had stolen out of it, until there was nothing left of his lie for anyone to believe. So she went to work, and the work took years, and it was the best work of her life. She began with the ledger, for Amos Wexler had been a careful man and had written down not only what Rourke stole but from whom, and she and old Thad Pike, who wept when she read him the letter and then wiped his face and rolled up his sleeves, set about the slow business of finding the wronged and their descendants. She traveled. She spent Rourke's kind of money in the opposite of Rourke's kind of way, on stage fares and telegraph inquiries and the patient tracing of families scattered by grief across half a continent. She found one of the Hollis brothers still living, gone blind and poor in a town 300 miles off, and she sat at his table and put into his ruined old hands more gold than he had lost, and she asked him to sign a receipt for it, and he wept and made his mark and asked her name, and she told him. She found old Marta Vane long dead, but her granddaughter alive and raising 4 children on a hard-scrabble farm, and Della paid the debt to the granddaughter, with interest reckoned honestly across the years, and collected her signed receipt, and moved on. She kept every receipt in a folder tied with ribbon, the exact and deliberate opposite of Rourke's forged papers, a ledger not of debts owed to her but of wrongs set right, and slowly that folder grew thick. And as it grew, something began to happen in Coyote Wells, something she had not planned and could not have planned, which was that the town began, very quietly, to live again. It began with water, because it always begins with water in that country. Della used a portion of the gold, always careful to keep only what an honest tradeswoman might earn, to hire Thad to teach 2 young men his old craft, and together they dug and cribbed and cased new wells and ran a proper line down the crooked street, and where there was reliable water there could be gardens, and where there were gardens there could be families willing to stay. She reopened a forge. Of course she did. It was the thing she was made for, and the town had need of it, and she set up her anvil in a shed beside the cabin and hung her father's hammer on a nail where she could reach it, and she shod the mules and mended the wagons and forged the hinges and nails and plow points that a living town requires, and she took her honest pay for it. Folk came to her not only for iron but for judgment, because word had gone quietly around of what she had done for the Hollis man and the Vane granddaughter, and a person who will travel 300 miles to give a blind stranger his due is a person whose word can be trusted with a dispute over a fence line or a debt between neighbors. She never advertised her wealth and never spent it on herself beyond a sound roof and good tools, and so no one feared her for it, and the gold moved out through the dying town like water through cracked ground, in wells and repaired roofs and grubstakes and small forgiven debts, an accumulating web of practical, reciprocal kindnesses, each one small, all of them together enough to bring a place back from the dead. And Silas Rourke? He was never brought low in any way that a newspaper would have printed. There was no showdown, no reckoning in a crowded courtroom, no moment when he stood exposed before a jeering crowd. Della never went back to Concordia, and she never wrote to him, and she never saw his face again as long as she lived. What happened to him was quieter and, in its way, more complete. For an empire built entirely of paper depends upon everyone agreeing to believe the paper, and belief, once it begins to leak, cannot be patched. Word traveled, the way it does, of a young smith down in the desert who was paying old debts that a certain valley banker had once conjured out of thin air, and of receipts, and of a dead miner's letter, and though nothing was ever proven in any court, men who had done business with Rourke began, one by one, to look again at their own papers, and to ask their own quiet questions, and to take their money and their trust elsewhere. His notes stopped being honored on sight. His name stopped opening doors. The great green ledgers that had been truer to him than anything living began to fill with numbers that ran the wrong way, and there was no forging his way out of those, because they were his own. He was not arrested. He was simply, over a handful of years, no longer important, and for a man who had measured his whole soul in importance, that was a death more thorough than any rope. He sold the land and loan and moved on, they said, under yet another name, to some other town where the story had not yet reached, and then the trail of him thinned to nothing, and he was gone, unmourned, unmarked, a column of figures that no longer added up to a man. Della felt neither triumph nor pity when the last word of him reached her. She felt the way you feel when a stubborn weld finally cools and holds. The thing was done. It had been worked along its true grain, and it had not broken. She was a woman past 30 by the time the town could truly be said to be alive again, and she was known, from the mountains to the flats, simply as Della the Smith, of Coyote Wells, a name that folks spoke with the particular respect they reserve for people who have proven, across years, exactly what they are. She had a house now, a real one, grown up around the old adobe cabin she had never had the heart to tear down, and she kept a garden green against the desert with the water she and Thad had raised, and she had a trade, and a place, and something she had not owned since the day the deputy read her out of the valley, which was the plain certainty that she belonged where she stood. Thad Pike lived to see it, and sat in her shade of an evening telling the young ones lies about the silver days until the last of them, and when he passed she buried him properly, and shod nothing else that whole day out of respect. On the mantel of that house, which she had built herself of desert stone laid true, she kept 3 things side by side, and anyone who asked was told what they were. There was her father's rounding hammer, its hickory handle worn smooth by his grip and smoother now by hers, the tool that had opened the chest and shod the town and earned her every honest dollar she owned. There was Amos Wexler's assayer's ledger, and beside it, in a frame she had made from the good oak of the chest itself, his letter, the plea of a dying stranger with honest hands, the truest inheritance of all. And there was the little carved wooden horse she had found beneath the floor, that had stopped her heart on the first night, whose story she never learned and never needed to. Gold she had found under that floor, and gold had done its work and moved on into the world where it belonged. But these were the things she kept, because they were not treasure. They were knowledge made physical, the grain of a whole life laid bare, and she understood at last that this, and not the coins, was what Amos Wexler had truly buried and what her father had truly left her, the plain and priceless certainty of how to make a broken thing whole. She was 19 years old, and she had been cast out of her home with $11, a wool blanket, and a hammer wrapped in oilcloth. She spent 6 of those dollars on a wrecked and roofless cabin at the edge of a dying town, a ruin that grown men laughed to see her buy, a thing the whole world had already written off as worth less than the powder it would take to burn it. It was the best $6 she ever spent. Not for the gold, though the gold was real, but for the letter beneath the gold, and the work the letter asked of her, and the life that grew up out of that work like a garden out of open ground. So thank you for sitting with us tonight, for banking the fire and staying to the end, for letting an old story do its slow and quiet work in you. If Della's story has stayed with you, share it with someone who understands that the strongest people are rarely the loudest, someone who values quiet strength and patient hands and the kind of courage that never once raises its voice. Follow along, so the next fire we build finds you gathered near it. And before you go, we would like you to sit with one question, the way Della sat with that letter in the lamplight. What have you found value in your own life, that everyone around you had already written off, some person or place or broken thing that the world walked past, and that turned out to hold more than anyone knew? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.